Good morning, everyone. My name is Hanadi Rifai, and I am the director of the Hurricane Resilience Research Institute. I would like to welcome everyone for joining us this morning for the inaugural series, the Resilience Series from HURRY, the Hurricane Resilience Research Institute. I'm glad you could join us this morning. So our topic today is hopefully one of interest to many of you. But before we begin, I would like to share some housekeeping items. We'll try to keep most of you muted to minimize sort of the background noises, but you have two ways of communicating if you have a question. We're going to try to answer, have a really live discussion after the presentation. So you can either raise your hand and or chat your question. We'll be recording questions as they are presented, and all of them will be discussed and addressed towards the end. Now, before we begin, I wanted to introduce those of you that do not know about the Hurricane Resilience Research Institute to what it's about and what the background of the Institute is. So HURRY was formed after Hurricane Harvey, and really in response to the challenges that we have all experienced in 2017 and since. So the HURRY Institute is really focused on changing the paradigm that instead of having damages and paying for them, the idea is to work towards resilience where we are prepared for them, we live for them, and we accommodate them. And so we define dimensions of resilience to kind of change that paradigm. Now, HURRY is a multi-university, multi-state. A good focus would be to say that it's focused on the Gulf of Mexico first and foremost. So we have participation from 6 universities, and that's the University of Houston, UT Tyler, Texas Tech, Louisiana State University, Miami, and Florida. And what the idea is that the universities are collaborating to not only be protective of their own coastlines and their own states, but also across the Gulf Coast, sharing the experiences that we all face. Now, this year's series, this inaugural resilience series, is focused on Texas. Texas is a state that has had the most number of more than $1 billion disasters in the last 20 years. And unfortunately, we've had, quite a lot of them since 2017. So today we're addressing one of the first challenges faced by Winter Storm Uri. And I'm going to introduce our moderator, Dr. Danny Reibel, who is the Donovan Maddox Distinguished Engineering Chair, Horn Professor. He's a professor both of chemical engineering and civil and environmental and construction engineering at Texas Tech. Danny is a member of the National Academy. And I will also acknowledge Dr. Kishore Mehta, who is also from Texas Tech and also in the Academy. And Danny and Kishore and myself are involved in coordinating a summit in October on natural hazards that is sponsored by TAMIST, which is the Texas Academy of Science, Medicine, and Engineering. So again, I welcome all of you and turn the program over to Dr. Reibel.
Thank you very much, Hanadi. And I do appreciate the opportunity to be with you here today and to moderate this and to introduce our speaker. Our subject today is one that is of keen interest to Texans. As many of you know, ERCOT, that manages our electrical grid in Texas, is an island unto itself. And as a result, if we end up with a shortage of electricity, we have real challenges in responding to those challenges since we're not connected to the national grid. We've had recent challenges both in that we certainly well publicized in the very large problems at Uri that are our main subject today, but more recently we've faced some challenges and as the summer started heating up and the potential for shortages of power just in the past few weeks. It's also a topic that continues to be in the news because we are trying to identify means of avoiding the problems into the future. And that's still very much a topic of conversation, and whether the activities that have been done so far have really mitigated some of the problems, or whether it's just we will face these again in the future, and that's an open question. So to talk about some of these challenges today, I'm very pleased to introduce Michael Weber, who's the Josie Centennial Professor in Energy Resources at the University of Texas. And he's also the Chief Science and Technology Officer at ENGIE, a French global energy and infrastructure services company. So I made him change his image a few minutes ago because he had a beautiful view of the Paris skyline behind his back, but it was too much light and we needed to be able to see his face. Besides, we don't want to be reminded of the fact that he's in Paris and we're elsewhere. But Michael is, again, serving these dual roles. I'm told that he'll be returning to the University of Texas full-time soon. And he has been really one of the leaders internationally in being able to both do research on complex energy issues, most notably energy and water, but also been able to translate a lot of that sophisticated understanding and these issues in a format that is more accessible to the public as well. So a person that can really be a true leader in this discussion. And I'm more than pleased to introduce a friend that I've known for quite a while and worked with for quite a while. Michael, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Danny. Appreciate that. And thanks, Anadi. It's great to have this opportunity to be part of this conversation. I thought I would make some remarks a little bit about resilience of the Texas energy system based on the motivation that Danny will share with you, walking through some of my observations and experiences of the Texas polar vortex in February with Winter Storm Uri, which I experienced. I was in Texas for that. So let me back up and just unfold for you a sequence of events. As you have climate change, you get warming of the atmosphere and the oceans, but the atmosphere does not warm uniformly. The Arctic regions warm faster than the mid-latitudes, and this mismatched pace of warming is suggested could be a cause of increasing wobbliness of the jet stream, if wobbliness is a scientific term. So the jet stream, which moves west to east roughly along the border in North America of Canada and the United States, becomes wobbly, and as it wobbles or becomes more like sinusoidal in shape, it brings Arctic air further south with these polar vortices and brings warmer, hotter air further north, like what we're experiencing right now with triple-digit temperatures in Portland and Spokane, Washington, and that kind of thing. So as you have the jet stream dip down, it can bring Arctic fronts thousands of miles further south than normal and bring hotter air further north. And this kind of thing happens. It feels like it's happening with greater frequency and greater intensity. Many of you remember the polar vortex, for example, 2014. So as you have this wobbliness in the jet stream and as you have colder air moving further south, it usually marches southward over several days. So in Texas, we saw the cold weather moving south. We had warnings because we really got to low temperatures in states north of us, and we could see it coming. And as the temperatures moved south and they were cold, a couple things started to happen. First is fuels started to freeze. At the same time that fuels started to freeze, demand was spiking because in Texas, we have about 60% electric heating and about 40% heating from natural gas and a little bit of propane. And so the demand for electricity is starting to increase a lot as temperatures plunge, as people turn on their electric heaters. So demand is really soaring and fuels are starting to freeze, which creates a crimp on supply. At the same time, or around the same time, power plants trip offline from broken or frozen equipment. And because the fuel system like natural gas is freezing up, there's not enough natural gas available to back up the other power plants we might need to turn on to back up the power plants that just turned off. And as the power goes off to accommodate these shifts in the fuel system, we turn off the power to the gas system, creating even more shortage in gas. So you have this like problem where frozen fuels lead to power problems, which leads to more fuels problems, which leads to more power problems, and you get cascading failure. And eventually you have a water problem where you don't have the energy you need for water. And so you have a lot of people who either have broken pipes or contamination and have boil water notifications for quite a while. This is a sequence of events of this Arctic front. And what I just told you is what happened in 2011, a decade ago. We had a freeze in Texas and we had these problems where freezing systems and spiking demand led to rotating blackouts and then boil water notifications. 2021 was the same playbook in many ways as 2011. We went through this a decade ago. That was almost to the day in February 2011, and I experienced that in Texas. And then in February 2021, I experienced that one as well. There are a few differences between the 2011 and 2021 storms, though. So let me walk you through some of those. First of all, the storm in 2011 was dry and windy, And the storm in 2021 was wet and windless. And this is important because if it was dry and windy, the wind turbines could still perform really well. In 2021, because it was wet, we had frozen precipitation or ice forming on wind turbines, and that forms an ice coating that makes it dangerous to operate the wind turbines because as they start spinning, the ice slides off like an ice javelin, which can kill people or do damage, and it can damage the equipment. And overall, we didn't have much wind capacity online that day because there wasn't much wind. Let me put some numbers on it. In 2011, we had about 8 gigawatts of installed wind capacity, and we got about 4 gigawatts of power out of it, which is pretty good, frankly, for that time of year. In fact, the wind production in 2011 was so good, the CEO of ERCOT at the time, Trip Doggett, basically sent a thank you letter or a love letter to the wind industry saying, thank you for overproducing compared to what we expected. You essentially bailed out the grid. Flash forward a decade, wind installations have tripled. So instead of 8 gigawatts of installed capacity, we have 24 gigawatts of installed capacity, but we're still only getting 4 gigawatts of output. We're getting the same output in 2021 as 2011, despite tripling the wind installations, because it was a windless storm and a wet storm. Major problem for the system. We also have problems with every other fuel and technology except for one. We had one of our 4 nuclear reactors trip offline because of a frozen pump on the feed water system, on the auxiliary or backup water system. We had coal plants trip offline because of frozen coal piles or frozen cooling water reservoirs or frozen water lines and equipment and pumps at the power plants. We had solar panels like those at my house that did not work because they were covered in snow if they did not have tracking. So the panels on my roof covered in snow. Now, snow on solar panels tends to melt faster than on streets. So after one day, my panels were back in operation. And the industrial ones, they have trackers. They actually could turn away from the snow when it snowed and then the next day turn right back. So solar ended up overperforming over the course of 4 or 5 days of the storm. But at the depth of the crisis, when it was nighttime or snowing, solar did not produce that much. The biggest problems, though, by far, were in the natural gas system. Natural gas started to freeze on February 10th, 5 days before the blackouts. And the natural gas starts to freeze because one of the things that happens when you produce oil and gas is you also produce a lot of water. And that water can freeze up at the wellhead. That's called a freeze off, or it freezes in the compressors or pumps or tanks or pipes or other places along the way, and it blocks off the supply of gas. At the same time that we're having freeze-offs that are constraining the supply of gas production in Texas dropped like 50% in a span of a day or two. The demand for gas is quite high because of all those homes and businesses that use gas for heating, but also because 50% of our grid in Texas is powered by gas. And so for those people with electric heating, half of electric heating is coming from gas or more, plus 40% of our homes use gas heating. So the demand for gas is really through the roof. At the same time, supplies are constrained because of freeze-offs. This becomes a problem because then it means homes are competing with power plants for gas. But by law in Texas, homes get the gas first. Then power plants are second on the list. Because there are so many freeze-offs and constraints in the gas system, pressures dropped, and some of these newer gas power plants require higher pressure gas lines. They could not get the gas they needed or could not get the gas at the pressure they needed. And so gas power plants were tripping off dramatically. In all, about 30 gigawatts of thermal power plants, nuclear, coal, and gas, predominantly gas, were not available at the depth of the crisis, in addition to the wind problems we're having. And that created this shortage where we didn't have enough power to meet the demand. So we had to go to rotating outages, where you rotate your outage around the state, except that we had so many outages, we could not even rotate them. So either you had power or you didn't, and that was the case for several days. Now, one other change that happened since 2011 to 2021 was the rise of shale in West Texas. So the shale revolution started kind of around 2008 in North Texas, the Barnett Shale near Dallas for gas production. But since 2011, the Permian, West Texas and New Mexico also has ramped up on production. And the Permian Basin is unique in 2 ways. One is it's a highly electrified oil and gas production region. It's, I think, the most electrified oil and gas production region in the world, because ERCOT has cheap electricity. That ERCOT's Electric Reliability Council of Texas, that's the Texas grid, to have cheap electricity out there. And so we have a lot of electricity driving operations. And the Permian is very liquids rich. A lot of water comes up with oil and gas in the Permian compared to, say, other shale regions in Texas. So it's a particularly electrified and wet zone of production in the world, which is a double risk because then it tends to freeze off because of the water that comes up with it, as I mentioned. But also it means when the power goes out, we turn off the power to the gas system, we make matters worse. This is part of the challenge. So there are a few differences between 2011 and 2021. The biggest difference, frankly, is that 2021 was colder for longer and wider. Every single county in Texas was below freezing at one point, which is pretty rare, and it lasted for several days. In 2011, it was more like 2 or 3 days. This time it was more like 5 days. So it's a worse storm. Plus, we have electrified liquid-rich production in the West. We have a lot more wind. We have all these other things that happen. So this creates the crisis. Cascading failures, where a natural gas problem becomes an electrical problem, becomes a bigger gas problem, becomes a bigger electrical problem, becomes a water problem. Ultimately, 14 million people under a boil water notification for several days. And by the way, as far as I can tell, that is an American record. The prior record was Milwaukee, I think a few decades ago, with 1 million people under a boil water notification. And we have blown through that record in Texas. We're #1 with 14 million. At my house, we had a boil water notification for 5 days when it was all said and done. So this was really an incredible storm. There are a couple $1 billion of lawsuits trying to sort out who did what first and the sequence of failure. And I can tell you a little bit more about that if you want. There's also something like $50 billion of electric settlement charges from that week, plus $1 billion or more of natural gas settlement charges, plus the damage from the burst pipes, the contaminated water, the lost business activity, you name it. This ends up being a $100 to $200 billion event, which is in line with Hurricane Harvey, which you mentioned at the top of the hour, Howdy, which is what I think $132 billion of damage. So we had a Hurricane Harvey event with Hurricane Harvey in 2017. We just had another Hurricane Harvey sized event in Texas a couple months ago. And this is after the big event in 2011, the drought in 2012. We have had a lot of expensive events. So this is just one more. So that was kind of the sequence of things that happened. Let me tell you about my house, because I'm an energy guy and I think about energy resilience, and I lived through the 2011 freeze, and I thought, well, I'm going to learn from that and I'm going to make some improvements. So at my house, which I remodeled in 2015 as an energy guy, my wife's an architect, we did a couple things. We put solar panels on the roof, a pretty big solar array. We invested a lot in energy efficiency, efficient appliances, triple pane windows, that kind of thing. I remember the power going out in 2011, so we installed gas backup to our furnace, which was a heat pump. I signed up for every power partner program and thing you can for demand response, energy efficiency, you name it. I did my part at my house. It didn't really help. So let me tell you why it didn't help. There are a couple of key mistakes I made that I'm trying to fix right now. So the first thing is, and I know this, so it's not really a surprise, but these are things that if you don't have in place won't help. Solar panels are not helpful when the grid goes down unless you have the ability to island your home. To island your home means to separate your home from the rest of the grid with an islanding switch, which you can only do if you have batteries or other things to fill in the gap. The reason why your solar panels don't work if the grid goes down and you're not islanded is because if your solar panels are putting power onto the lines and the grid is down, when line workers work on the lines, they can get electrocuted. So for safety reasons, we disconnect the solar when, even if it's the sun is shining and the grid is down, you can't get the power. So my house had solar panels that were covered in snow, but even when they weren't covered in snow, I couldn't get the power because I didn't have an islanding system, because I didn't have a battery, and I didn't have a battery because the batteries were too expensive in 2015 when we sought to remodel. By the way, in 2020, I asked for an updated bid on batteries, still too expensive. I just got another bid 3 weeks ago, $28,000 for the battery backup system of my house. Too rich for my blood. A natural gas generator system would be more like 4K, something like that. So my house had solar that didn't really help. I also had gas backup with a very efficient electric heat pump. So electric heat pump for my house for heating, but gas backup. Before the power went out, and I didn't lose power for a few days. I was on a critical circuit because I'm on a circuit with a wastewater treatment plant. Yeah, or with a water treatment plant, excuse me, and close to like a fire department and that kind of thing. So my house was on a critical circuit. I did not have the power cut off to my house, but the power went off 2.5 days later anyway, because of frozen equipment on the distribution system. So the distribution system are the low voltage wires and poles that bring the power to your house, and transformers struggle when it's cold. There are trees that get really heavy from the ice and snow that snap and fall on the lines, creating a short, this kind of thing. Before the power went out, I didn't have heat in my house, even though I had electric heat pump and electricity and gas backup. And the reason is because a heat pump is essentially an air conditioner in reverse. And in Austin, I signed up for the Power Partners program. The Power Partners program is a demand response program that lets the city of Austin turn off my air conditioner for 5 minutes every hour to reduce peak demand in Austin. Well, they had the ability to turn off my air conditioner, and it never occurred to me, even though it's kind of obvious looking back, that that means they could also turn off my heat pump furnace. So they were turning off my furnace remotely to reduce peak demand in Austin, but they weren't doing it 5 minutes an hour like they did for air conditioning in the summer. They turned on the heat 5 minutes per hour, and I did not have heat for 55 minutes per hour, and it was cold, even with all my triple pane windows and insulation and everything else in my house. So it started to get really cold in our house. It got down to the upper 40s. It was never life-threatening, but it was uncomfortable for sure. So for several days, even though I had power, I didn't have heat, essentially. Then the power went out, and I didn't have heat or power. Now, let me explain the natural gas backup. I knew that power outages for heating would be a problem, which is why I got gas backup. And even though the gas was still available at my house, the controls for the heat pump and the furnace and everything, in addition of the water heater, you name it, were electric. So when the electric power went out, I didn't even have gas because I have electric controls. And I maybe needed a battery this big to manage the electric controls, as opposed to a battery the size of 2 refrigerators to run the whole house. So I had invested in efficiency with solar panels and efficiency and resilience and gas backup, and it still didn't work. So this is the thing, like, you can be thinking about it and study it and still screw up. And certainly that was the case with me. And so now I'm looking at batteries or gas backup, islanding switches. There are a couple of things I'm looking at, so my house is more resilient next time. By the way, the most resilient systems in Texas at the time were propane tanks and firewood, or old school gas furnaces, like a fireplace where you turn a key and can light the gas, no electronic controls. Manual systems were more reliable than the electric controlled systems or the more sophisticated control systems. So that was my house. It got cold, we lost power. We slept at our house, but we spent the days at a friend's house so that we could walk about a mile away to a friend. They had power and heat and internet. So like, okay, we're going to hang out there. So that was my experience. I think my experience was okay because I could walk somewhere else a mile away and get heat. But there were some people in the hill country of Texas where, because it happened at the time of a snowstorm and ice storm, could not get in their cars or walk in the hilly country up the icy roads to get anywhere else. They were trapped. And the emergency responders couldn't get to them either. So this is where you have a real life or death situation. By the way, official death tolls just below 200, but the unofficial toll is more like 700. The official toll will certainly rise as time goes on. So if we look at excess deaths from just that week, 700 people died. That's a pretty big event to have 700 people die. So that's the situation in Texas. Then what happens next? Well, there's a 3-phase process of 2011's Any Guide. The first phase is finger pointing, which goes on for several weeks, maybe even a couple months. We saw that even while the storm was happening. In Texas, we were blaming wind turbines, out-of-state liberals, the Green New Deal, you name it, right? There's a lot of things we blame, certainly not Texas or Texans or fossil fuels and that kind of thing. So that happened. That moved on after a while into the forensic analysis. In 2011, it took 6 months. The official report from FERC came out in August 2011 for a February 2011 event. So it took 6 months to really do the authoritative report on what went wrong and how, what sequence and that kind of thing. By the way, that report in August 2011 had all sorts of great recommendations that we mostly ignored. So that's something we can talk about. And then you go from forensic analysis to phase 3, which is implementation of solutions. And I would argue that in 2011, we did not do phase 3 enough. Whether we will do phase 3 of actually implementing solutions this time is yet to be seen. We're still doing the forensic analysis. So we'll see how this goes, but there's still a lot of finger pointing and analysis to go. Let me talk about root causes. There are many root causes. Oh, let me back up a little bit. And I said gas and wind and solar and nuclear and coal all failed. The big winner, although solar overperformed over 4 days, but at depth of crisis, it underperformed. The big winner was actually hydro. Hydro is the only fuel technology that overperformed. We did some massive releases at the dams, and we don't have much hydro in Texas. We only have a couple hundred megawatts, but we were producing a lot more power from those dams than we normally would in February at the same time of year. And it might be that those hydroelectric power plants bailed us out, because at the depth of the crisis, we were seconds to minutes away of a complete blackout, a complete system collapse. And when you have a complete system collapse, you have to do what's called a black start. You're starting from the dark, and you can't turn on the grid from black start automatically. You have to do it one power plant at a time. Imagine it's like a domino setup that makes a pretty pattern. You knock the dominoes down and you see all the dominoes fall. You can't just set the whole pattern back up. You set it back up one domino at a time. That's the way it is with our power plants. You turn on one power plant at a time. So a black start in ERCOT, we don't know how long it would take, but it probably would be weeks to months. And thankfully, we avoided that crisis. We had bad blackouts, but it wasn't the entire grid. And it might be the hydro bailed out. Hydro really overperformed. But there's some challenges with that, because if you have a sudden release of water through the dam you weren't expecting, that can accelerate downriver erosion, right? So it's not like this is impact free, though it helped to keep the lights on. Let me talk about gas, because in my root cause analysis, gas was the first system to fail dramatically. It started to fail February 10th. And by February 12th, many gas companies were issuing force majeure declarations, which means they had promised to sell gas to customers, and they just said, we can't because of an act of God, the act of God being Winter Storm Uri. So I guess we now know God's name is Uri. And the gas system started to do these cutoffs. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is they did not, well, in addition to the high level of liquids, they did not winterize. We knew in 2011 that the gas system depends on power and the power system depends on gas, and that this interdependence invites cascading failures. We advised officially, we collectively, community, but FERC officially with this 2011 report, said we should winterize the gas system and winterize the power plants. The gas system mostly did not winterize. That was the first failure of gas. The second is the gas systems that are electrified signed up for interruptible power. That means they sign up for a lower rate for electricity, for cheaper electricity, but in exchange, the utility can cut off the power to the gas system. So they signed up to be interrupted. They did not sign up for firm power, which is interesting. A third problem with gas system is it volunteered for what's called the ERS, the Emergency Response Services, which is something ERCOT does when ERCOT has tight conditions. The grid will go to people and say, we will pay you to turn off. And gas companies raise their hand and volunteered to be paid to turn off. They got paid a lot of money, but then they turned off their load. So that means the gas system was signing up for interruptible power or volunteering to have its power to be interrupted, which means it wasn't reliable, because when the power got turned off to the gas, it couldn't produce the gas, which turned off the supply to a power plant, which turned off more power, which turned off more power to more gas, which created this accelerating problem. A fourth challenge with gas is the gas system, for the most part, did not sign up as a critical infrastructure. Because of 2011, we know the grid operators turned off power to critical infrastructure like hospitals, but also to the gas system. And so people can sign up to be critical and not be turned off. It's like a 2-page form. Hospitals and sort of firefighting locations, the first responder locations, and water treatment plants all sign up as critical infrastructure. The gas system was supposed to, but hundreds of them did not. And that meant they either didn't know they were supposed to fill out the form to be a critical infrastructure, or they didn't fill it out because they knew they had signed up for interruptible power. They knew they wouldn't be there when we needed them in a storm. A fifth problem is they were disrupting even firm contracts. So when you buy gas, you could buy a spot contract, a fixed contract, a firm contract. Firm means that the gas company is guaranteeing the supply of gas, but they were cutting off even their firm contracts. So when I look at it, there's lots of blame to go around. There are a lot of problems of Winter Storm Uri, but the gas system in particular seemed to struggle. And this is important because the brand of gas is that it's reliable and wind is not, and Winter Storm Uri is forcing us to reconsider that. Let's flash forward to a week ago. A week ago, we're getting conservation alerts in ERCOT. The temperatures are hot. It's not ridiculously hot, but it's hotter than normal for June. Demand for air conditioning spiking. Some power plants are offline for maintenance because it's a shoulder month or low demand month. At the same time, about 11 gigawatts of power plants had forced outages, meaning they had to go offline and do maintenance whether they wanted to or not. 8 gigawatts of the 11 were thermal power plants, meaning nuclear, coal, or gas, and there was a mix, and 3 gigawatts was wind. So this is a problem where even in the warmer weather, the power plants still aren't as reliable as we need, which is a real challenge. So what could we do next? There are a variety of solutions we could do. One is we can improve efficiency. If we improve the efficiency for our homes and businesses, then we demand less energy for heating and cooling. Peak summer demand in August is about half from residential air conditioners. And for Winter Storm Uri, it was probably about half total energy demand for heating or more. So making our devices and our homes more efficient helps reduce demand, which eases up on the load a little bit. A second opportunity or solution is demand response. Now we do that in industry. Industry can turn off their demand to get a lower rate, as I mentioned. That's something they've already done, but we don't do that much in the residential sector. Well, the city of Austin was turning off my heat pump, but they were not compensating me for that. So if they developed a paid demand response program, then every person's home in Austin could be rotated, or Houston or whatever city, And if your home's like 5 kilowatts of peak demand, and they rotate you off, I don't know, once every 5 or 10 minutes, then you can really get gigawatts of savings statewide at the push of a button rather than building new power plants. And we simply don't do that. In France, the peak demand is in February for heating, excuse me. So February 2016, I think, was the record for France, about 100 gigawatts. Texas peak demand is like 75 gigawatts. So France had 100 gigawatts of demand. They, with a pulse they send on the lines, can turn off 2 gigawatts worth of electric water heaters at a moment's notice to do demand response to balance out the grid. This is something we could do. That technology has been around for decades. And we have a lot of water heaters or pool pumps or non-critical infrastructure in our homes that we can turn off to spare a lot of demand. And by the way, that's a whole lot cheaper than building a new power plant. So the first thing we should do is efficiency. Second thing we should do is demand response. Third thing we should do is supply diversification. About 80% of the power in Texas is from thermal plants. About 75% is from fossil fuels. 20% is from wind and solar. Most of that is wind. We have room to diversify further. We can do more wind, more solar, and more geothermal. That gives us a range of performance options that aren't completely aligned with gas and therefore might complement the failures of gas. I think that's a real opportunity for us. A fourth technical solution is more storage. We could store gas in caverns. In fact, storage caverns did very well with gas. Maybe we should have used more as opposed to a just-in-time gas delivery system. But also we could use electrical storage of batteries to give backup to homes like mine if you have solar, but also just to reduce demand in the grid at peak times, which would be really helpful. A fifth solution is tied into storage is microgrids, having smaller grids, community level, campus level, that get some inherent efficiencies, but then move steam around for heating and has alternative ways to get the heat for that steam. Could be electric boilers, could be gas boilers, that kind of thing. And the microgrids would build in more resilience as well. A sixth thing we could do or should do is winterization. Invest the money to make the gas system more reliable in cold weather. Invest the money to make the power system more reliable in cold weather. That might cost something like $5 to $20 billion statewide, and it would take place over several years. This is a lot of money. But if that 5 to 20 billion lets you avoid a $100 to $200 billion damaging event, well, then it's easily worth the money. That's something we should consider. And then the eighth thing we should do is plan for the future of weather rather than the past of weather. Rather than using the last 15 years extreme weather events to drive our decision making, we need to anticipate using climate science what the weather will be and build for that weather over the lifetime of the plant rather than what it was a few decades ago when weather was conveniently more mild. So there are a lot of things we can do. We have solutions. We've seen these problems before. It was pretty tricky in Texas, got pretty cold. I would have preferred to keep the heat and power on. And now we have some legislation dealing with it next, which requires a winterization of power plants, but not of the gas system, which is kind of silly because then you might have gas power plants that would work just fine if they could only get the gas, but they can't get the gas. So there are some solutions like that legislatively that don't seem like they go far enough or are missing some key points. So that's kind of my overview of the Texas situation. I'm happy to stop there and just answer questions and hear what you're interested in, and then we'll talk about that. So thank you very much for the invitation, and let's go into Q&A if we can.
Thank you, Michael. And I can't think of a better example than your home of the interaction of all these complicated things that make resilience a really tough problem, and tough to actually do it on a system basis, but even on a home, quite impressive.
Yeah, and even if for people who are thinking about it, right? That's I think that's something that's like, and obviously I make mistakes and some things I could have, should have done, but at least I was trying. I still failed, and so it just shows that even if you try, that's not enough because it's a complicated system.
And you're not exactly your average consumer in the energy marketplace.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So opening it up for questions. If we are using Zoom, so you can just unmute and begin to ask your question. Or if we have multiple, I would ask you to go to reactions on your Zoom menu and choose raise hand.
And there we go. And I think, Hanadi, you have a question already in the chat. Do you want me to go ahead and answer that one?
Yes, that would be great. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to go slow. So go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So Europe, the question, what's different in Europe that we can learn from? So there are a couple of things that are different in Europe that are important. One is Europe, compared to Texas, designs for colder weather for the most part, except in some of the Mediterranean locations. And in Texas, we design for hot weather, even though we get cold weather every once in a while. So Texas will get hot weather every year, but we get really cold weather about once a decade, maybe more frequently in the future, we'll see. So we design around those 3 to 4 months of hot weather we get every year, not the few days of cold weather we get every once in a while. Whereas Europe has a lot of northern climates and has a lot of heating load that they need in France, all the way through Scandinavia and that kind of thing. So it's designed for the cold weather by intention from day one. There are other things that are different in Europe. Europe has a more powerful regulatory structure. So there are things that will happen in the US, like the gas system in the US is pretty leaky. A lot of methane leaks out. The leak rate in Europe is much lower because the regulators just say you can't do that, and the companies comply with that. But they also regulate a standard of reliability that's a little bit higher. Another thing that happens is the wires and poles, the transmission distribution system in Europe are much more likely to be underground than they are in the United States, partly for public acceptance reasons, which is they're ugly. And so people put them below ground to get them out of sight, out of mind. And because the power system has much more below ground infrastructure, it doesn't fall over when it's windy and doesn't freeze over or get hit by a falling tree the way it might in Texas. So there are a couple design approaches because of regulations and the weather and the approach and social acceptance that leads to a more resilient system. They don't have nearly the number of blackouts as we do in Texas, and they don't have the susceptibility to windstorms and freezes, that kind of thing. Now, the next problem for Europe, though, will be the cooling load from hot summers. Only a small percentage, like 4% of homes in France are air conditioned, some ridiculously low number. It's like the other way around in Texas. But air conditioning is on the rise in Europe as temperatures go up and as people like the comfort of air conditioning. And so electric demand in the summer will start to really increase. And is the system ready for that or not will be one of the questions. So that's a difference for Europe versus Texas.
So then just a quick follow-up, if I may. In Ike, we had power failure for totally different reasons. And so where does one, how do you make the decisions about investing in the distribution network versus the generation?
This is a great question. So Ike had all sorts of power failures in ERCOT and Southwest Power Pool were different. So parts of Houston are in ERCOT, parts of Eastern Houston are in the Southwest Power Pool. And there were parts of Houston after Ike that were without power for like 2 weeks. The energy capital of the world was without power in some locations for multiple weeks. A lot of that was wind damage from knocking over the wires and poles. Hurricane Harvey was different. Hurricane was more of a rain event than a wind event, although it was very windy, like in Port Aransas further south. In Houston, there was less the wind that was a problem, it was the rainfall that was a problem. So much rain fell out of the sky. And I can't remember how many was it, just the trillions of kilograms of water that fell out of the sky. And if you think it's worth $1 per metric ton, ends up being about $132 billion of water fell out of the sky, doing about $132 billion of damage, which I think is some sort of sick irony by Mother Nature or God or whoever. there's just kind of amazing amount of water fell out of the sky. And that became a problem because some of the energy infrastructure got flooded, and in particular, coal piles became too wet to burn in some cases. If you go back to Hurricane Sandy in 2012 in the Northeast, they had a lot of below ground lines in New York and Connecticut that got flooded, and above ground lines in the same areas that got knocked down by the wind. They all have a weakness, but the below ground systems tend to have more robustness. They tend to fail less often. Now, they're also slower to bring back online. So the above ground systems are more resilient, but less robust. Below ground is more robust, but less resilient. And this is one of the things, like renewables are less robust. They fail every day at one point or another, but they're more resilient. They come back a few hours later or the next day. The nuclear power plants are very robust, but they're not so resilient. When nuclear power plants go offline, they take a little bit longer to bring back on. And so usually I recommend we need a suite of options because they all have complementary strengths and weaknesses. And if you have the right kind of inventory and the right kind of diversification of fuels and technologies, then you get a better system overall. And Europe has that with its infrastructure, its regulations, and diversity of supply.
So there are some other questions on the chat, and I have one as well, but let's get to the other questions on the chat. Can you see those, Michael, or would you like me to read them?
No, I can see it. So a question from Bilal Khan, why Texas is not considering freeze protection for gas plants? What's their rationalization? So Texas is considering winterization for gas power plants, but not requiring the same level of winterization for the gas processing facilities, wellheads, compressors, antifreeze systems, pipeline operators, that kind of thing. And I don't know how to say it other than it's political. The gas industry is very influential in Texas. It's very politically connected. It gives a lot of money to elected officials. And it told the elected officials, we really don't want you to regulate us anymore. And the officials basically said, okay, we won't, even though that was a major cause of failure. I think as a consequence, it sets us up for major problems the next time there's a freeze, because the gas system actually made a lot of money off this. Gas prices went from $2 to $600. Gas prices went up by a factor of 300. And even companies who had frozen equipment and had their production decrease made more money, because some wells would freeze, but some wells wouldn't. And they lost production from the wells that froze, but the wells that kept working earned 300 times the revenue on gas. And so the takeaway for gas was, well, that was profitable. And so a lot of suffering and death and destruction in Texas was actually good for business for gas companies, for the producers. And therefore, they don't really want to winterize. Actually, these scarcity prices, these high price spikes are kind of useful for them. So it's partly because of their economic rationale, and also just a distrust or disdain of regulation in general that led them to pretty actively lobby to make sure that they would not be regulated to meet certain minimum standards for winterization. So I think that's the long answer, is that ultimately it was political, and partly because the gas industry didn't want it, and they didn't want it because they did okay in the whole time. They made a lot of money. They made billions of dollars. You can see this with the gas companies reporting their results financially at the end of March, at the end of Q1, including the February storm event. They're like, yeah, banner year, $1 billion bonanza, Energy Transfer Partners, $400 million bonanza, Continental Resources. So these gas companies made a lot of money, and that's why they didn't want to change it.
It's a bit of a sobering thought there.
Yeah.
Death and mayhem being good for business.
I mean, death and mayhem is good for business, usually at morgues and cemeteries, and construction workers who can rebuild. But for the gas industry, it doesn't seem to be that bad for business.
A COVID-related question for you.
Yeah, so have COVID-related supply, this is from Francisco Hasis, I don't know how to pronounce your name, I'm sorry. Have COVID-related supply chain disruptions affected our recovery from Winter Storm Uri? And if so, to what extent? I would say absolutely. There are two things going on with global supply chains. One is the COVID-related interruptions, and now is the recovery, inflation, and demand. There's so much demand for materials that the materials can't keep up, but also that we're still recovering from disruptions. Other things like the Suez Canal, what was that, a month or so ago, when the ship got stuck in Suez Canal? We're still feeling the repercussions of that, because that shut down a lot of traffic for that one particular choke point for several days. And so that's affecting things. So there's several things going on at once, but supply chains are disrupted. If you've tried to buy furniture from IKEA recently, which my wife and I have tried to do, they have long delays or can't deliver at all. And that means there's a problem for the grid, because if you need extra transformers or insulators or parts, it's just harder to get it. Frankly, that was a problem before COVID and before Winter Storm Uri. There's already been talk about creating a national transformer stockpile, because we can't make them fast enough. And if there's a major problem, how do you rebuild everything? So this is an area where resilience planning should talk about, are there key components that we need to have a lot of extras of laying around, because you can't go make 1,000 of them very quickly when you need them. So I think there's all sorts of disruptions. Francisco, great question. And it might be tied in with some of the problems we're having in the Texas grid just last week or this week with the heat and conservation alerts, which is there's still some equipment broken at power plants. They're not all the way back, frankly, these days. Next question is a Kishore about ERCOT. Why is ERCOT not connected to the national grid? And is there a plan in the future to connect to the national grid? And this is a great question. The reason why ERCOT's not connected to the national grid, and frankly, there are 3 grids, East, West, and Texas. There are 2 national grids for the eastern half, western half of the United States. Alaska and Hawaii have their own grids as well, but the 2 main ones are East and West, and then Texas. And Texas does not connect to the grids, the east and western grids. And in ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, which is that Texas grid, doesn't cover all of Texas. It covers about 85% of Texas, but there are parts of El Paso, the Panhandle, and East Texas that are on either the western or the eastern grids. And so ERCOT, which covers 85% of Texas, is not connected to the other grids for the most part, because they don't want to deal with federal regulators from crossing state lines and the way other states need to do so. We have state regulators of the Public Utility Commission of Texas and the Railroad Commission for oil and gas, that kind of thing. But if you cross state lines and engage in these other grids and the power markets, you trigger the need for federal oversight from FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, And Texans basically just don't want that. So we say we're not going to connect. Having said that, we do have a little less than a gigawatt of direct current DC ties to Mexico and the Eastern grid. And that's 1 gigawatt or less out of, say, 75 gigawatts of peak demand. So this isn't a big part of the grid. 1% to 2% is connected to the other grids. And so we can borrow power from other states or sell them power if they need it, but they're pretty weak interconnections. And the question is, can we do more? Yeah, absolutely, we can do more. In fact, there's a project today called Southern Cross that is a 2 gigawatt interconnect that would connect to maybe the Western grid or Western and Eastern, I can't remember. That would be direct current, DC, not alternating current or AC, and therefore we'll get to avoid some of the regulatory oversight. So there might be some ways to increase the connectivity without triggering federal oversight. But frankly, I would say I think we should connect, because 99.9% of the time we'll sell our excess wind and solar to other states for a handsome profit. And I would love it. And I know Texas love it when they can sell Californians a lot of energy for a profit, for example. So if we connect at a greater level, we can sell more power for more money, more days of the year. And then the 0.1% of the time we need reliability services, we can borrow power from our neighbors, or they can borrow power from us and we can prop them up. So I think connectivity would be good for the economy and for resilience, but it would also be good for the environment, because it's easier to build renewables in Texas than any other state. And therefore we can help other states decarbonize. It might be cheaper for them to decarbonize, to buy wind and solar from Texas, than it is to build their own closer by. So hopefully that will help us get to the point where we connect. I think that'd be good for us, and like to see that happen. And Danny, I could just kind of keep on rolling if you want on that, or do you?
I think so. I think this next one is an interesting connected to that. Good follow on.
Have you or your colleagues, a question from Maria, in your area presented these findings to ERCOT, Governor Abbott, or other decision makers? Yes and no. Governor Abbott's office is not reaching out to me, but I have spoken with ERCOT. I have several former students at ERCOT. We've done a 5-year modeling project for ERCOT that just ended. We know them well. And I've also met with at least one of the PUC commissioners, and I met with about a half dozen different state legislators in the legislative session while they were drafting legislation. So absolutely try to make myself and my team, the students and postdocs and friends of ours who are experts in the area available as a resource to the policymakers. I think it helped a little bit. The legislation got better as we engaged more. It's not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction. And I'll talk to any policymaker anytime. I'd love to make myself available. That's our job as professors, I think, is to try to provide expertise into the decision-making process wherever we can. Next question from, I think is from Syed. Would expanding Texas's capacity for hydroelectricity increase power resilience significantly? And if so, what prevents Texas from expanding such capacity? Generally speaking, hydro performed very well in Winter Storm Uri. And historically, hydro could be a very good source of electricity. It's pretty cheap once you've built it. It's pretty cheap to operate. It's renewable. It can be turned on very quickly, even if the power is out, because gravity works even when the power is out. So hydroelectric is very appealing. The problem with Texas is we don't have the right terrain or the right water availability. So either we have the terrain in West Texas or the water in East Texas, but we don't have the water where the terrain is. And the terrain is, you need altitude differences between high and low. So pumped hydroelectric or hydroelectricity tends to do better in places that are mountainous with steady flow of water. And that's for pumped hydroelectric would be like Colorado, California, Michigan, Switzerland, that kind of thing. Traditional hydroelectric in Tennessee Valley Authority, very hilly with the Appalachian Mountains, or in the Pacific Northwest with the Rockies and the Columbia River and that kind of thing. So hydro is very appealing if we get more, but we don't have much more spare capacity in Texas for it because we just don't have water flowing at the right volume across the right depth of altitude change, which is what we're missing. Now, if you do have all that, you will have your own problems. So California has a lot of hydro, but they're having reliability problems from their hydro because it's a low snowpack year. The snowpack's basically already gone. And in California, you have wet years and dry years, but the snowpack is so robust that even on dry years, you will still have snow, and that snow melts to form runoff, and that runoff goes to the rivers, and that river water gives you hydroelectric. But in California, suffering major drought and with zero snowpack is going to have much lower hydroelectric output. So if we build hydro, it can back up the other system, but it assumes you have the water. And if you don't have the water because you don't have snowpack or the climate's changing or whatever, then your hydro system becomes a liability, not a benefit. So that's all part of it. There's no simple answer with any of this, it seems.
Might add as well with the, since we're reliant upon reservoirs in many cases to build that hydroelectric power, our heyday for building reservoirs really ended much in the 60s, and our environmental concerns have largely eliminated
Yep.
any
That's right.
new reservoir capacity.
Most new hydroelectric construction in the world is not in the United States or Europe. It's going to be in Latin America, Southeast Asia, or in Africa, where environmental movements are not as empowered to stop it, where the need for power is more acute, where the benefits of hydro are in this complex set of trade-offs. So we're not going to build much more hydro in the United States. We could build some small hydro, run-of-the-river hydro, low-head hydro, maybe it's a 5-foot drop, 10-foot drops like that. These tend to be in the kilowatts or tens of kilowatts, maybe low megawatts, not like the Columbia River Dam and the Columbia Gorge, which is 6 gigawatts, which is like 6 nuclear power plants. So we can do some small hydro. And the real opportunity for the United States is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which owns a lot of dams for reservoirs, for water impoundment, or for navigation. And those dams often do not have a powerhouse. So we could add powerhouses to existing dams in the United States, but it would be hard to build new dams for the most part. Not impossible, but it's pretty rare. So as Danny said, most of that build out was ending in the 60s and basically done by the 70s, at least in the United States.
Now a question about backup generators.
Yes, question here. So many homes are installing backup generators. I'm trying to do that now. Will that help create more demand on natural gas that would not be possible to meet during the winter storm? There was plenty of gas for homes and businesses in the storm, but there was not plenty of gas for homes and businesses in the power plants. So if we have natural gas backup generators, they would get the gas they need for the most part to back up your house, but it might make the supply crunch on power plants even worse. And so I'll tell you, because the batteries are so expensive for my house, I'm probably gonna get a natural gas generator, because I then could island with my solar panels, use gas just a night, but the gas generator gives me the ability to island for much less money than batteries. And then probably I don't even need gas for the generator very often. The power doesn't go out that often, but it goes out often enough that I notice. So it would create some more demand, but it's not clear what's happening in the gas power plants. That's the tension of that being an issue. And but there's a risk that you wouldn't have enough even to meet residential load, even though they're first on the priority list. So that's something we got to keep an eye on. Oh, another generator question by Carrie Guthrie. Building on the home generator question, do you know how close Texas homes were or could have been to losing natural gas supplies during Uri? I don't think gas homes were ever that close to losing gas at our homes, other than a few isolated pipeline breaks or something like that. For the most part, there was plenty of gas for home heating, cooking, and water heating. So that was never an issue. It was really the power plants and industry that got cut off, not homes. And part of that's by law, because in the 1970s, there was a gas guy named Oscar Wyatt who sold gas on 20-year fixed price firm contracts to the cities of Corpus Christi, San Antonio, and Austin. And then it got cold in the 70s and he cut off their supplies and then sold gas for a much higher price elsewhere. So because of that, there's now a requirement kind of in response to Oscar Wyatt where homes can't be cut off, cities can't be cut off. You have to sell the gas to them. So, and I think the demand for gas for homes, while a lot, could be met with gas supplies. It just puts a crimp on the power system because those gas power plants, I get it.
Of course, it isn't much use if you don't have power to your control system and your fan, because your furnace will not turn on without it.
But that's if you have a gas generator, it might give you enough power for your electronic controls, for your fan, your blower, and that kind of thing. Or you have solar panels or the battery or something like that. Yeah. So, and the amount of electricity for the controls is like small batteries. The blower, like that moves the air around, is a bigger battery. It's like 500 watts, but it's not quite like a compressor, which is like 5 kilowatts.
No, absolutely. And that's an interesting point, is that maybe we should be expanding that, is battery backup for the control and fan systems.
Yeah.
And I don't think I've ever seen one of those. Are those commercially available?
No, it depends on how you lay out the circuits in your panel and your circuit breaker too, because it might be for the AC system, either your AC or heater gets electricity or it doesn't. They don't break out the compressor from the air handler necessarily. So you'd have to design your circuits the right way and then have backup just for the circuits. Even in the summer, If your air conditioning is not working, but the fan can still circulate air, that would be helpful, and that might save lives. So something like that would be a good way to go. Another question from Bilal: how can the federal government incentivize ERCOT to fix future freezes as infrastructure spending bills in action? Great question. The bazillion-dollar infrastructure plan has money in it for grid modernization and updates. So I think there's just money, and they would just make it available for states to do projects. And Texas is funny because sometimes we don't want money from the feds, even if it might save lives or improve things. So who knows if that bill will pass Congress or if Texas would accept it, but there is money in there for improving the grid. And so it doesn't even have to be incentivizing. It's be like, here's the money, go do it. And for Texas, we know it's in the billions to low tens of billions. So say 5 to 20 billion. And there's something like 160 billion for grid updates and stuff in the bill. Texas is about 10% of the population. So maybe we get 10% of that grid update money, which is like 16 billion. Well, that takes us pretty far. So there's enough money in the infrastructure bills to cover a lot of these things if we want to collaborate and play ball. Question by Gordon. Would it be feasible for the thermal power generation plants to keep on-site fuel reserves for say 72 hours of operation when the fuel transmission system goes offline? Great question. And the answer is yes, but so let me tell you what the implications are. And backing up a little bit, this was part of the motivation for a big push from former Texas Governor Rick Perry, then as Secretary of Energy Perry for the Trump administration. Perry was pushing to reward power plants that store fuel on site, which is primarily coal and biomass. They have piles of coal or piles of wood chips and pellets. And he wanted to create rules that would pay them for that and punish gas, wind, and solar power plants that don't store fuel on site. So there is this idea that having fuel on site is good for resilience or robustness of the grid. However, coal piles froze in Winter Storm Uri and weren't available. They flooded in Hurricane Harvey and were too wet to burn. Sometimes they're brought in by trains where one train bridge blowout in Nebraska means you can't get coal to Texas for 45 days, which is why they usually store like 60 days of coal on site and that kind of thing. So even the power plants that use fuels you can store on site have their own weaknesses, but generally speaking, storage is one of the solutions that lets you hedge one of these disruptions. Gas is much more voluminous and takes much more volume to store. However, you could store it as liquefied natural gas, much less volume, like 600th of the volume, to have LNG storage on site and then gasify the gas as needed for your power plants. So on-site fuel reserves should be helpful, but with the examples of Hurricane Harvey or the freezes with coal and biomass and wood chips, doesn't always work the way you need it to. Question here from Aditya regarding the icing of the turbines. Are there any alternatives to the blade material to deal with the icing, or are there other systems in place to overcome this problem? Great question. The answer is yes. There are a couple things that can happen. One is they have coatings that are hydrophobic that help prevent the precipitation from accumulating on the blades. You can add heat tracing or heaters to melt the ice. And you can also add ice detection equipment that doesn't really prevent the ice from forming, but lets you know the minute it has, so that you can take action. And then those are all elements, by the way, of a cold climate package for wind turbines. The other one is synthetic oils that don't freeze as readily. So you don't want your lubricants and other oils in the cell freezing. And so and by the way, we operate wind turbines in cold climates quite often. And they just get the cold climate package when they order the turbine. It's like an option. Like when you buy a car, you might get the anti-rust coating treatment as an option on your car because you live in the Northeast and you know that they salt the roads every winter and the salt can cause corrosion of your car. So you might want that option. It is much cheaper to buy the cold climate package for wind turbines up front. I want to say like tens of thousands of dollars, maybe $50,000 on top of the $1 million plus per turbine cost. So it is a noticeable amount of money, but it's not a ridiculous amount of money. However, if you don't get the cold climate package and then you wish to retrofit the adder, it is added in later. It is much more expensive to add it in later than it is to buy it in the first place. And the other thing is, in a place like Texas, where wind farms are looking at the weather, it's hot 4 months a year and cold a few days every few years. The cold climate package sounds great for those cold days, but actually it takes up space in the equipment box and then the cell at the top of the wind turbine. And because it takes up extra space, the wind turbine has trouble shedding heat, which makes it perform with lower efficiency in the summer. So the cold climate package can improve your winter resilience, but it decreases your summer resilience or your summer performance. And this is the trade-off for some of these systems. But absolutely, wind turbines operate in cold, wet parts of the world, but they're designed a little bit different with some different equipment, that kind of thing. Question from Hanadi: should winter storms be a design criterion for infrastructure, much like a 100-year storm? I would say yes. And I think that the problem with Texas is we tend to look at the past weather, not the future of weather. We're building assets that last 25 to 100 years. And with climate change, that weather will be different over the lifetime at the end than it was at the beginning. And so I think we should do that. We tend to look backwards and say, what's the worst storm we can imagine and design for that? But we need to be doing what's the worst storm we can imagine, and it will get worse, and it might happen more often. And then how do we design for that situation? So I think that's something we should do with planners for sure.
You know, the drought of record in Texas is still the 50s drought. And, you know, it's undoubtedly going to be exceeded at some point in the future. And
yeah,
the
tree ring data. Yeah, tree ring data says what the 1400s might have been worse, the 1500s, like so. We know worse droughts are possible. That's something we should prepare for sure. And worse floods are possible, hotter heat waves, colder cold snaps, that kind of thing.
So I guess a follow-up on my question then would be, well, let's say I want to do a generator, right? Get one of those. Let's say for grins, it costs $20,000 and a delivery into the future because they don't have it right now. But at the end of the day, over the last 20 years, we lost power due to these events, maybe 20 days total, right? Or so you're looking at investing all this money in a generator that you're going to use one day a year, essentially.
Yep.
I mean, to think about it that way. So how does one do that? I mean, at the individual level, forget institutions, forget states, but how do you make that decision of sort of redoing your piping and insulation and adding a generator and all of the other things you would need to do to really become more resilient at the individual level or the community level for natural hazards?
I mean, this is the key, right? So it costs money. And for me, I have a good paycheck and I care a lot about energy. And so maybe I'm willing to spend the money because even if it's not worth it economically, I get some learning out of it that's useful for me as a professor of energy. But how many people meet those criteria, right? So usually it's just it's a business deal. And let's say it's $4,000 for a natural gas generator or $20,000 for the solar backup, no, for the battery backup. By the way, that's on top of the solar panels, which can be anywhere from $10,000 to $25,000 depending on the size of your house. Right. And so, in the roof and the size of the panel array and that kind of thing. So we're talking about a lot of money for the solar panels, a lot of money for storage. Is this worth it? Well, maybe if it lets you avoid $100 a month of utility bills for several decades. So for me, the solar panels pay for themselves. They're expensive, but the payback period, I did 2 arrays. I did an array in 2015. I just upgraded the array last year. The array I got in 2015 has like a 12-year payback period. The array in 2020 is more like an 8-year payback. So that's a long time for me to put a lot of money up front, but then I'll save $100 a month for years if I get it back eventually. So there's an economic argument for the solar. The batteries are still kind of pricey, even though battery prices drop every month and the performance goes up. Batteries are still expensive. Then it becomes this thing where, like I use the solar panels every day, at least partly. The battery I wouldn't use every day necessarily, even if unless I tried to charge it with the solar, but then they kind of adds degradation and cycles and shortens the lifetime of the battery, but maybe I could do that. But the battery is really about those handful of days every once in a while when you might need some power. So it might come down to, do you work at home or not? I work at home a lot. My wife works at home. Power feels pretty important if you want to work from home. And how much is your work worth? Because if you're worth $1,000 a day and you think the power might go out 4 times in the next 15 years, you might pay $4,000 for a generator to save your $1,000 a day for 4 times over those decades. But if your time is worth a couple $100 a day and you only have an outage a couple days every 2 decades, the math doesn't add up. So the economics isn't good enough. It's cheaper just to go without. But what's happening is these outages seem to happen more often. Frankly, I've had 6 outages in 2021 of 1 hour or more at my house alone from Winter Storm Uri and elsewhere, mostly because of wind blowing branches into from the trees into the power lines. 6 outages in my house, 41 hours, 17 hours, 2.5 days, and several for a couple hours. That's a lot of time to go without power. And so it might not be an economic thing, it might be just a convenience thing, because every time the power goes out for too long, I have to throw away a couple $100 worth of food from the refrigerator. And then there are other issues. So the economics are tricky for this at the individual level. At the collective level, where we get economies of scale and we can rate-based stuff, or we can share the costs in different ways, resilience is usually worth it to a point. Perfectly resilient is too expensive, but we want 99.99% resilient, not 99.8. So that's something you might get. Even 99.8% resilient is still several hours a year without power. So anyway, the economics are tough at the individual level, frankly. If you're in a affordable urban grid or something, if you're off grid, you would pay the money to do it yourself. And so I've got this extra social or professorial motivation, or just this convenience factor. Like, I don't really want to throw the food away every time the grid struggles, so I'm willing to pay a little more for it. But not everyone can. Even if they want it, they don't have the money for it or whatever. I do think the backup systems, microgrids, and those technologies will drop in price, though, so it'll become more appealing, because this market's really developing and the supply chain is maturing right now.
It's interesting, it is the classic problem of, the risk described as probability times impact. And so, for example, I definitely have power backup to a home in Michigan, because if that power goes off for a few hours, which is a fairly high probability, the pipes are going to freeze, and I have got a lot of problems.
And once the pipes freeze, then you're talking hundreds of dollars of damage for the pipes alone, maybe thousands of dollars of damage to the flooring or slabs and all that kind of stuff. And it gets expensive quickly.
And so my last point to be really getting your input is, so if we're going to have rolling blackouts because of extreme heat and they can't generate enough power, so where does that fit in? I mean, we do that every summer in Texas, right? I mean, it's just...
Yeah, and so we don't have a lot of answers about what's happening this week in last in ERCOT, but certainly the power plants had a rough ride in February, and they're kind of limping along, so they're breaking more easily as part of it. But to have nearly 10 gigawatts of forced or unplanned outages of thermal power plants is unusual for sure. So I think we just have to invest more. We kind of deferred on maintenance last year. A lot of maintenance that normally happens last year didn't happen. So the power plants were a little more fragile than before anyway. We're growing as a state. We have more people, we have economic growth, we have more activity. We have more of us working at home because of COVID. So the electric demand at home is up, whereas normally that demand would be in our offices, which have more efficient systems usually. So there's a lot to happen. I would say we need to build some more power plants, certainly do more efficiency, certainly do more demand response. Let's build some microgrids and storage. Let's come up with some more solutions. But having the grid struggle in February and then struggle again in April, we actually had a conservation alert in April, and then again in June, that seems like too much.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Like I said, I can talk forever, but I think we need to.
Yeah, I think we're closing up. I guess if I can, I'll just point out that you may or may not realize it, but Lubbock recently moved to ERCOT, and until Storm Uri, I would say we were thinking pretty ambivalent about that, but I would say there's a lot of concern in Lubbock now.
Yeah. I mean, the question is, in Lubbock, you might get cheaper prices. The power is probably going to be cleaner, but is it going to be flimsier and less reliable? I guess time will tell.
Well, I certainly want to thank you very much, Michael, for your insight in this, and I really appreciate the rousing discussion after your presentation. And so again, thank you very much. And Tanati, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you from us as well, and from the Institute, very engaging. And I can tell you, for one, that I'm not brave enough to talk without slides. So I think you did a great job. So we got to learn from that. But we will provide a recording of the presentation so that others who signed up but were not able to join that can listen in, and you might get some questions as a result of that. So we do appreciate your participation, and thanks to everyone who attended today.
That sounds great. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
In Paris, and we'll see you back in Texas, hopefully soon.
That sounds great. Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.